Hello, this is Brad Palushak, and in today's video we'll be covering basic setup of Sitebulb. Now, I found Sitebulb a few years ago, not very long after they literally started and released the first version. And ever since, I think this tool is just great. I would encourage everyone who's just starting with SEO or doing SEO for their own business, smaller scale, to really look at this tool. And by the way, I'm not affiliated with them or associated with them in any way. Now, so I don't think it's overly difficult to configure Sitebulb, but I think in general it's worth going through all the setup options just to explain to you guys how to use it. Now, at the very end of this video, I'm going to summarize a simple setup that I usually use, so we don't get bogged down with all the details and you don't have to choose them all by yourself. So let's get into it. Obviously, when you open the crawler Sitebulb, you will probably have a little sample project in here so you can see how everything works and looks like. Now, obviously you would want to create your own project, and this is where you do it. You click new project and then you put down a domain. Now, I'm going to use literally a random domain that I picked up a few minutes ago, petfoodreviewer.com. Project name doesn't really matter, so we don't need to worry about it. Obviously, I'll name it as Pet Food Reviewer because it's what the site is. Now, you may notice up here, there's a little information telling you that this site is using Cloudflare. So in order to crawl this site, Sitebulb is going to limit the number of URLs it's using or it's crawling per second to just one. I think some of you guys might have your shops, your website on Shopify, and therefore the same limitation applies. It's just Shopify or Sitebulb, they automatically try to find if people are attempting at any DDoS attacks or any other attacks. Therefore, if they see too many requests from one place, from one IP, they block them. That's why Sitebulb kind of like takes this precaution for you and automatically tries to limit it to just one URL per second. Now, as you saw, I clicked next. And what is happening now, Sitebulb is pulling some basic initial information from the website so we can use it in just a second. I'm going to go from top to bottom on this screen and discuss all the options. Then I'm going to jump into advanced settings. Now, audit type, you have two selections here. Standard audit, which means that Sitebulb will basically crawl everything that it can find on the site, while sample audit limits the number of URLs that Sitebulb will crawl to a certain number. I don't quite remember what it is, but it gives you a very quick overview of what's going on the website. I usually use standard audit because I want all the data pulled in. Now, crawler type, there's also two options here. The first and most popular is HTML crawler, which is fastest, but at the same time does not execute any JavaScript. The second one is Chrome crawler. It's much slower, but it also executes JavaScript. Now, to give you a rule of thumb, if your website isn't running on JavaScript framework, right, like AngularJS or React or something else similar, mainly JavaScript based, then I would probably go with HTML crawler. It's faster, it's reliable, and if there isn't much stuff happening in pure JavaScript, then it's completely enough. Now, this option here, you would select it only if your website was running behind a login screen or something like that. And then Sitebulb allows you to basically log in through here and add this authentication data for the crawler. Going down here, page speed. Now, what's important, if you select this option, you also need to automatically select the second one. In order for Sitebulb to execute and run with page speed, it needs to have access to resources. If you want to know a little bit more about it, you have it here, but basically page speed measures time to first byte and the load time of the site, of every single page. It runs mobile-friendly tests and some front-end tests as well. Now, in page resources, it's worth to also crawl images, CSS files, JavaScript, fonts, and everything basically that is selected here. Now, if you also want to keep style sheets or JavaScript files with this query string parameters, you can select it here. But I would say that in 95% of cases, this isn't needed. Now, international, if your site is using hreflangs or any other international targeting, this is when you would want to select it. If your website is using AMP, then you would also want to select it. And also there's a very important option. If your site uses only AMP or AMP, then this little tick box should be clicked here. Now, for your site, if you have access to Google Analytics or Google Search Console, you can also select these options here. What it means is when you give Sitebulb access to your Google Analytics or Search Console, once it finishes its own crawl, it also pulls the data of all available or known URLs from one of these tools or both, and then compares it with what it managed to find during its crawl. Going down to extraction, these options are actually a little bit more advanced. You can make Sitebulb extract structured data for you. You can also make it extract content based on different rules that you give it. And also you can search for some content in here. I'm not going to go through any of these options in much more detail because, like I said, I find them to be directed at more advanced users who would in general know what these do. Now, in terms of the URL sources to audit, you should always have crawl website selected. This is basically allowing Sitebulb to crawl your website. Sometimes you might want to feed it with sitemap that is available for your website. And as you can see, Sitebulb tries to automatically detect sitemaps and add them onto the list here. I'm going to skip this option here because I don't need it. Now, under URL list, you can also create your own list of URLs that you want Sitebulb to crawl. And lastly, on this page, you can also schedule the audit to run once or recurring every Tuesday or something like that. To be frank with you, I've never used this option. Now let's get to the advanced settings. Now, in order to run with additional options in code coverage or accessibility, you would have to turn Chrome crawler on because it's not running with just HTML one. I'm going to skip this because I would guess or I would assume that you won't be using this option very often. Now, in terms of the configuration, you can also set the HTTP response timeout, which means how long Sitebulb is going to wait for each URL to load, how many redirects it is to follow, if it is to block any ad scripts, if it is to check for duplicate content, readability scores, parse HTML tables, analyze links, which is a very useful option for assessing your internal linking. You can also check external link status and enable cookies. In all honesty, I go with these options as they are set by default. Now, in terms of the speed, as I said earlier, this site is running on Cloudflare. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to set Sitebulb to run with only 1 URL per second. When it comes to the limits here, I usually go with the standard. You would only want to increase these numbers here if you had a very big website. But usually, 500,000 URLs, it's quite a lot. In terms of the content, you can extract some content or point Sitebulb at the exact div or the exact element that holds your main content on your website. When it comes to diagnosis, I quite often like to save HTML for further debugging, but not always. So I will skip this one for this scroll. Now, in terms of the robots.txt, this is how Sitebulb is behaving on your website. You can save any URLs that are disavowed in the robots.txt. You can select it if the site is staging, so then Sitebulb doesn't respect no index directives. You can make it to respect or not robots.txt directives. You can also make it to audit no index URLs, so all URLs that are marked clearly as no indexed. You can make it not to crawl canonical URLs. You can make it not to crawl alternate URLs or pagination. And in any case, when there are some problems with crawling the site, you can also change your user agent. Now, in terms of the virtual robots.txt file, this is where you could potentially change the robot.txt file directives that are on the site or this site you're crawling, being it your own or competitor, and make Sitebulb behave slightly different. But I would say in most cases you would just leave these options as they are. Maybe sometimes you would want to see all the disallowed URLs. In terms of the subdomains, this is actually slightly tricky. Google treats all of the subdomains within the main domain as separate entities, kind of like they're like separate websites. So in this case here, you can actually make Sitebulb treat them differently, treat them as integral part of the main domain or the domain or subdomain that you're currently crawling. And you can also select or unselect whether or not you want Sitebulb to check subdomain link status. This one, again, I don't usually change this. In terms of the URLs, you can exclude some URLs. By the way, in exclusion here, this is what Sitebulb has defined out of the box. These come from some URLs that WordPress usually generates for comments and replies. So basically, Sitebulb already has it predefined. You can also exclude parameters, or you can rewrite URLs. Again, a few sets of options that I usually just run with the defaults. When it comes to any HTTP headers or stuff like this, I try not to change it. What I would do though is I would change the default language to obviously your own language like German or any other language if it's not English in these options here, because it allows Sitebulb to better understand and better run with spell checks and stuff like that. Again, you can add HTTP authorization if the site comes up with a little username and password prompt upon visiting it. And you can also set proxy if you want to crawl it with somewhere else. On here, under the data tab, you can basically select different folders where you want to store all the data for this audit. And finally, under ignored hints, you can select which hints Sitebulb will not show you, because, for example, you don't really care about them, or they quite frankly don't apply to your website. So I think I changed robust to save disallowed URLs. What I want to do, I will also save HTML, because I like to keep this for future reference. Going back to crawler settings. Out of all of these, obviously depending on the case that I'm working on, but I would say that a rule of thumb, especially if you're doing an audit for your own website, you would want to select page speed. If you're using a lot of structured data, you would like to have Sitebulb extract structured data, and also you would sometimes want to show HTML XML sitemaps. I'm going to try to quickly pull up a HTML sitemap, sorry, XML sitemap for this website. I'll see if I can guess the URL. And yes, I did. So it's domain / sitemap _ sorry, index.xml. And this is a standard URL for all the sitemaps that are generated by Yoast SEO. So this one was fairly easy to guess. Okay, once it's set up like this, I'm just going to untick this box because this website doesn't require any authentication. Once it's set up like this, you can start now, and Sitebulb will be crawling the website. So I think in general, this is everything that I wanted to show. I honestly think Sitebulb in general is very easy to use. It's very easy to set up. Once it finishes the crawl, it will also basically show you the summary of everything it found. It will show you some major or critical issues that it found. So you can basically grab the suggestions, do a little bit more reading on them, and implement. So I hope you liked this video and found it helpful. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email or find me on social media, and I'll try to help. And for now, have a nice day.